Good evening. I'm Malcolm King, interim president of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our historic Great Hall. For 165 years, the Cooper Union has been a New York City forum where influential and everyday voices were able to come to debate ideas and participate in the civic life of our nation. Tonight, we're thrilled to partner with the Tenement Museum to continue that legacy. Tonight's conversation is part of our Gardner Foundation Great Hall Forum, a series that seeks to connect today's voices with those who have contributed to shaping the life of our city in the past. As you may have seen from the sampling of Cooper alumni and Great Hall speakers featured outside of this building's windows, the Cooper Union has welcomed the designers of some of history's greatest monuments. William Maxwell Evarts, who chaired the American Committee for the Statue of Liberty and helped organize the construction of its pedestal, made several appearances right here in the Great Hall. In fact, our institution's founder, Peter Cooper, along with his son-in-law and Cooper Union trustee, Abram Hewitt, were among those who contributed funds for the pedestal. Quite literally, as we say, helping Lady Liberty find her footing in America. But beyond financial support, Peter Cooper's legacy is tied to the stories we tell about the meaning of the Statue of Liberty and our identity as a nation. Cooper opened the doors of this institution as a free center of learning for all people, regardless of race, religion, gender, or class. A principle that benefited generations of immigrants, migrants, and refugees seeking opportunity right here in the East Village and throughout New York City. Cooper believed that fair access to education for all is indispensable for democracy. Our program this evening explores the Statue of Liberty as a monument that embodies both the tensions of American democracy and its promise of equality. We're immensely proud to bring this timely conversation to the Great Hall and to be joined by such an extraordinary group of speakers. My thanks to each of them. I'd like to thank our friends at the Tenement Museum, as well as the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation for their collaboration and support in bringing us this event. Now, to get the evening started and introduce tonight's guest, I'm pleased to welcome public historian, author, and the president of the Tenement Museum, Dr. Annie Polland.
Abraham Lincoln touched this podium. It's wonderful to be together here in the Great Hall, and it's especially wonderful because we're able to kind of use this space to connect to history and layers of history that are so important for New York. Since 1859, people of all walks of life have come here to hear speeches and to debate civic issues. Clint Smith, award-winning How the Word is Passed, shows how powerful it is to put our bodies where history happened. We know from the video that Lincoln, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, and others spoke from this stage. But tonight I want to take more of a Tenement Museum approach and think about you sitting in the seats and who are the people who sat in these seats. I see the educators. What was it like for ordinary people, many of them tenement dwellers, to come to this hall and debate current events? For the most part, the people who gathered here were not content. They had things to talk about. They desired change. They sought inspiration. The Tenement Museum considers their perspective every day. We teach their stories through educator-led tours of our two 19th century tenements, where we recreate the apartments of real immigrant, migrant, and refugee families. For those of you who have been to the Tenement Museum, has anyone been besides? Great, excellent. Yay. And raise your hand if you've led a tour at the Tenement Museum. Right, okay. So you see, so if you've led a tour at the Tenement Museum, you know that one of the things that people really respond to is the sense of crowdedness that's in that space. And we're able to then explain that many people lived much of their lives actually outside of the tenements. They sought space. The Great Hall had a special appeal too, because not only were there important debates happening, it was also free. It was, I mean, think of this. At the time, this is one of the only places you could go to gather together that wasn't a church or a synagogue or some kind of, it was a secular auditorium for people to talk about American identity. I'm going to give you just a few examples, and I think we can see some of them on the screen, of some of our apartments at the Tenement Museum. So you can imagine the people who might have sat in the seats that you're sitting in now. We have the Joseph and Rachel Moore apartment, set to be 1870. Joseph and Rachel likely were at Cooper Union in 1870 when they joined their neighbors in celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment. The primary source that you can see on the screen talks about the way in which their neighborhood in the 8th Ward, which is now Soho, had banners celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment, the ability to vote. And again, think of Joseph Moore, who has been living in the city for over a decade, working. He cannot vote because of a state law that bans people black men from voting unless they had $250 worth of taxable property. So he lives through the draft riots, he lives through the Civil War, and it's not until 1870 when the 15th Amendment is passed that he's able to vote. So imagine this celebration, and this celebration was a procession then that ended here at the Great Hall at Cooper Union. Another image, to give you another example of a family that would have been connected to this space. We have a German lager beer saloon where we tell the story of the Schneiders and people who not only drank beer in their lager beer saloon, but also met in meeting halls. And we know through the German newspapers of a variety of clubs that met in those spaces. And we know that one of those clubs in 1871 met here at Cooper Union to support Oswald Ottendorfer, the editor of a German language newspaper who would later run for office. But get this, they were here, they were gathered here in the seats you're sitting in to talk about corruption in city government. Everything was resolved. The next image takes us to the Chinese immigration. Chinese immigrants on Mott Street and Mulberry, the early Chinatown, gathered here at Cooper Union in September of 1892 to form the Chinese Equal Rights League, protesting the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that had just been renewed. And finally, last but not least, our Under One Roof tour tells the story of the Rogoszewski family, an Eastern European Jewish family whose daughter, Bessie, worked in the garment industry. We think it's very likely that she might have been in one of the seats that you're sitting in today when, on November 22nd, 1909, a young woman, Clara Lemlich, got up in front of the International Lady Garment Workers Union, and maybe right here from this podium, from this pedestal, started the Great Shirtwaist Strike of 1909, right here from this stage. These are just little tastes so that you can come to the museum and learn more. But tonight, we're going to take what the Tenement Museum does, again, focus on the tenement dwellers, focus on how ordinary people debated the issues and ideas of their time to effect change. And we're going to take that focus and think about the Statue of Liberty. Just as the causes that filled the Great Hall changed over time, so did the many meanings attributed to the Statue of Liberty. And just as the Tenement Museum centers both the stories of Black tenement dwellers and immigrant tenement dwellers, we're eager to apply this dual lens to this wonderful and important symbol and statue here with you tonight. So tonight, I'll give you a little bit of a game plan. It's so fun that you guys just get to just rest. You're not up here doing this stuff. It's hard. So we're going to talk tonight. The first thing we want to do is talk about the statue's connection to the abolition of slavery, something that isn't very well known. But so we're going to make that more well known. We're going to then talk about the statue's connection to immigration. Today, this is so woven into our understanding of the statue that it's hard to imagine a time that it was not connected to immigration, but that is the case, and we'll tell you how that came to be and how it eventually did become associated with immigration. Next, we're going to try to figure out what to do. How do we teach this fuller history now that we know that it's here? And finally, we'll be inviting your questions. So if you haven't received a card already, someone, raise your hand and someone will bring you a card and a pen so that you can write down a question that we will hopefully get to towards the end of the program. Another very exciting part of this game plan, and I'll introduce the panelists in just a moment, but interwoven into our conversation, we'll take a brief kind of intermission, not intermission where you get up. You get to sit in the seats where history happened. But the great Anna Deavere Smith, the wonderful actress, will be reading primary sources of the time to kind of ground us in some of the words that would have been spoken here in this hall and around the city. So I'm going to invite the panelists to come out and join me in the little lounge settee area. It is such an honor to introduce these wonderful panelists. I couldn't think of anyone, we have the best people here to talk about the Statue of Liberty. We have Clint Smith, author of the award-winning book, New York Times Top 10, How the Word is Passed, and writer for The Atlantic magazine. We have Nancy Foner, distinguished professor emerita now, just emerita, just turned, but she's still working on 2 book projects, and she's already written or edited 20 books on immigration. The wonderful sociologist Nancy Foner, and the historian Ed Berenson, the author of 8 books, and tonight we'll be focusing on the Statue of Liberty, a professor of history at NYU. So welcome. Thank you so much for being. And we're going to start tonight with, again, what kind of inspired this program is Clint's chapter on New York in his book, How the Word is Passed. And so I've asked him to read a section of the chapter that talks about his education and how he thought of the Statue of Liberty and how he came to learn of the statue's connection to abolition.
For most of my life, the Statue of Liberty was one of a number of pieces of American iconography that seemed to memorialize an idea that had never materialized. It is a feeling, I suspect, many Black Americans experience with respect to pieces of history that commemorate an ideal of US history. What is the Declaration of Independence but a parchment of half-truths and contradictions? What is a monument to the Revolution if it doesn't say who was kept in chains after it ended? The Statue of Liberty is an extension of a tradition that seems to embody the contradictions of America's promise and a reminder that its promises have not always been extended to us. As the narrator in James Baldwin's 1960 short story says, "This morning, this evening, so soon," as he puts it, I would never know that what this statue meant to others. She had always been an ugly joke to me. I made my way back outside toward the statue. Dozens of languages commingled on the island's crisp afternoon air. I walked to the edge of the water in front of the statue and looked up. I could see the small specks of people moving around the pedestal, providing me with a new scale for the size of the statue. From this angle, I couldn't see the statue's feet, however, and couldn't see the chains beside them. As I looked around the perimeter, I actually couldn't see any place from which someone would be able to see the chains. They weren't only partially hidden beneath her robe, it seemed they were fully hidden from anyone who wasn't viewing the statue from a helicopter. I looked at the tablet in Lady Liberty's left hand and considered, for a moment, how different the statue would have been, in both design and symbolism, if there were broken shackles in that hand instead. There were only a few ferries left back to Manhattan before the park would close, so I made my way back to the dock and boarded the next one, taking a seat on the boat's second level near a window. As the ferry pulled away, I peered through the glass and took one last look at the statue before it began shrinking into a distant silhouette of itself. My eyes moved to Lady Liberty's feet, and I thought I could see the faint contours of broken chains, but I might have imagined seeing them, because I finally knew they were there.
Thank you. And And did you just learn of the chains on that visit to the island from a guide, or had you been reading about it in preparation for your book?
I discovered it on that visit. And so, for context, as you put it, I wrote a book about the history of slavery through the lens of historical sites across the country. And so I visited prisons, plantations, monuments, memorials, museums, neighborhoods, all sorts of places to try to get a sense of how the story of slavery was being told and how it was being distorted in various parts of the country. And I have a chapter that the book largely focuses on the South, but I have a chapter about New York City, about New York and New York City specifically. And the chapter ends by, after a sort of examination of the developing an understanding of the relevance of slavery to New York City, both in terms of the sort of way the financial institutions of New York fueled the slaveocracy of the South, but also in terms of how slavery was omnipresent in New York in its earliest days. And at one point, there were more enslaved people in New York than there were anywhere else in the world. At one point, the port of New York was the second largest slave port in the country after Charleston, South Carolina. Slavery was so deeply embedded in the infrastructure and political, social, and economic landscape of New York City that in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, actually suggested that New York City secede from the Union alongside with the Confederacy because the political, social, and again, economic landscape of this city was so deeply entangled in what was happening in the South. And so the Statue of Liberty is also this sort of, it is not only, as we'll talk about, this symbol of immigration, it's something that has come to represent the tensions and the contradictions and the sort of hidden histories of how slavery existed in New York, and it also exists or doesn't or fails to exist in our sort of collective memory of what slavery was. And so this journey, as most of the book was a sort of journey of discovery. And so going to Liberty Island, I had some sense, largely from Ed's work, of what the relationship to that there was a relationship between abolition and the end of slavery and the existence of the Statue of Liberty. But I did not understand the evolution of how it came, the sort of process by which La Boule suggested that, how his politics were interwoven in the decision to present this gift to the United States, and then how it was interwoven, how those sentiments and those political inclinations were embedded in the earliest designs of the Statue of Liberty, in which the earliest design of the statue had, and this is what the end of this chapter is alluding to, the earliest designs, instead of having a tablet in Lady Liberty's hand, it was broken shackles that were meant.
And I think we have an image, so we can put that up to illustrate.
That were meant to symbolize the abolition of slavery and the sort of celebration of the United States, ending the Civil War and emancipating 4 million enslaved people. But that was perceived as something that was not, given that this was the end of the Civil War, it was not understood as something that would unite the country, and that there would be a lot of difficulty fundraising and creating a sort of collective sense of pride in something that had just torn the country apart. And so over time, the sort of model and idea of what the sort of physical manifestation of the statue and its symbolism would look like changed, and the broken shackles moved from Lady Liberty's hands to her feet. And you can't, what I allude to in that part is that you can't see the shackles unless you are sort of viewing it from above. And I have this moment at the end of the chapter where I'm standing next to the shackles, or I'm standing next to Lady Liberty, I'm standing next to the pedestal, and I don't realize that I can't see the shackles, even though I'm aware of their presence. And it's kind of this metaphor in some ways for how the history of slavery and the legacy of slavery, the scars of slavery are part of the landscape all around us and kind of hidden in plain sight. And so they're present even when we can't necessarily see them, but so often they're right next to us.
And am I correct in my interpretation, and that there's like a glimmer of hope in that because you could see, you could see them because you knew that they were there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my whole book project, and certainly the New York chapter is a really specific manifestation of that. It was a journey to fill in the gaps of my own understanding, or rather my own misunderstandings. So that, this book emerged from a desire to, from a recognition that I grew up in New Orleans, in a place that was the heart of the domestic slave trade. I am the descendant of enslaved people. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. And I remember watching the several Confederate statues come down in New Orleans in 2017, statues to Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard, and realizing that I didn't understand the contours of the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate with the impact and legacy that it's left on this country, despite my my geographic proximity and my sort of lineage. And so I spent 4 years traveling across the country and ultimately to New York in an attempt to make sense of these things that I wish I had been taught when I was younger. Because I think the idea is that when you're taught about the truth of the Statue of Liberty, or the truth about the prison industrial complex, or the truth about all of these different iterations of our social, political, and economic systems, and you understand the extent to which and the specific ways in which they're connected to slavery, it gives you a clearer sense of why the landscape of racial inequality looks the way that it does today. And so I think that's absolutely true. It's, for me, the discovery of the chains, of the fact of the chains, and the sort of evolution of how the chains were moved also represents this idea that even when things are moved or shifted or purposefully meant to be less conspicuous, whether in a statue or in our education system, the discovery of them can be incredibly clarifying. And in that clarification, there is a sort of liberation, right? For me, the process of learning this information was very much something that was an emancipatory experience, a liberating experience, because you realize that you can't be lied to anymore about why the landscape of inequality looks the way that it does today, and that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but it's because of what has been done to those communities, or extracted from those communities generation after generation. And I think, the Statue of Liberty is one example of a sort of symbolic manifestation of that.
So let's go back, because this goes to France, the idea, right? And I believe it was a dinner party shortly after the assassination of Lincoln, where some of the initial ideas, if not for the statue, but for the idea of a gift came about. So do you want to take us to France?
In June of 1865, a group of French abolitionists got together at the home of a man named Edward de la Boulaye, who was a professor of American studies, actually, and...
But had never been here.
What's that?
But had never been here, right?
Yeah, right. And so La Boulaye wanted to do something to express sorrow over the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, who this group of Frenchmen adored. And it was a group that included a brother of de Tocqueville and a grandson of Lafayette. So these were people who were connected to the United States and to the idea of American liberty. They had a very idealized view of the United States, but when they got together at La Boulaye's home in Versailles, they said, we need to do something. We need to make a gesture to show our sorrow over Lincoln and also our joy that the Americans had finally abolished slavery. The French abolished slavery in their colonies 15 years before we did. And so this was not the origins exactly of the Statue of Liberty, but it was the germ of the idea that what the idea was is that we French abolitionists should give a gift to the United States, and that gift should say something about the importance of having ended slavery. And so that's the origin of this story. And so it took about 5 years before the first model that you saw a couple of minutes ago was designed by the sculptor whose name was Federico Augusto Bartoli. And that first model had a little piece of chain in its hands. And you can see then over the next 5 years or so, that model evolves into the actual statue. And pretty quickly, the chain in the hand disappears. It's then replaced by the tablet, and the broken chains are relegated to the bottom under the foot of the Statue of Liberty. And I think the reason for this, there's two reasons for the chains being demoted. One has to do with the nature of Reconstruction, which followed on the heels, which Eric Foner has written so beautifully about. The nature of Reconstruction, which unfolded in a way that ended up being really controversial, and it worried a lot of people in not just the South, but in the North. And so the memory of slavery became something that you wanted to talk about less and less as Reconstruction proceeded. And then there was an event in France in the spring of 1871, the Paris Commune, which was an uprising of Parisian working people who took over the city for a couple of months. And the radicalism behind that also scared those who were involved in conceptualizing the Statue of Liberty. And so I think it was the fear evoked both by how Reconstruction unfolded and the radicalism of the Paris Commune led to a distancing from the idea of commemorating the abolition of slavery.
So by the time Bartoli comes here to fundraise, has that idea already fallen off? Like, I'm just curious, did anyone ever know about this more publicly, this connection to the abolition of slavery? Like, who would have been talking about it? What sources kind of connect the dots?
So, and one of the really, I think, most fascinating things about history is not always what we remember, but what we forget. And so that idea about the abolition of slavery got very quickly forgotten. And as far as I know, I could be wrong about this, but when I was doing research for my book, I discovered a wonderful book written in the 1970s by an art historian named Marvin Trachtenberg. And as far as I know, he was the first person to discover those early sketches that showed the broken chain. And before that, as far as I know, essentially nobody remembered that the Statue of Liberty was originally designed to commemorate the end of slavery.
And so if it wasn't then, when Bartoli comes to fundraise and the papers start to talk about it, what did it come to represent? What was being sold to people? Like that this statue is merely a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States? Was it supposed to symbolize anything more? And what did liberty mean? Like how were they selling it?
Right, all great questions. First, we have to keep in mind that a long time passed from the original conception, which was 1865, to the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty, which is 1886. So it's over 2 decades. A lot changes during that period. And so there was a joint committee of American and French people who were going to figure out how to finance the building of the Statue of Liberty. And so the French part of the committee said, we're going to raise the money to build the statue. No money came from the French government, no money came from the American government. And so that's why it's wrong to say that the Statue of Liberty is a gift from France to the the United States. It was a gift from the French people to the American people.
And newspapers played an incredibly important on both sides of the ocean.
So on both sides, there was an attempt to raise money for something that people in France said, well, why are we asked to raise money only to give what we come up with to the Americans? And so there was some controversy over that, and so the sculptor Bartholdi and the people around him were really clever. They created dioramas. Diorama was the kind of an ancestor of the movie, and so you got on a prop that made it look like you were in the front of a boat, and the scenery moved, and you got the impression that you were moving forward, and all of a sudden you saw a Statue of Liberty before you. And so there were images of the Statue of Liberty before it even got built. And so there were those images, there were little models that were sold, there were a whole variety of fundraising events. But the thing that really broke through was that Bartholdi came up with enough money to build the arm and the torch of the Statue of Liberty and sent it over to be displayed in Philadelphia for the centennial of the American Revolution in 1876. And you could actually go inside the arm, you could climb up to the torch, and it was wildly popular. People loved it. And so when then the arm and the torch came to New York, it was displayed in Madison Square, and people loved it again. And so when it was sent back to France, people there thought, wow, the Americans like this thing. And so they were able to come up with the money to pay for it. But then you had new problems. So not everybody knows this, but the Statue of Liberty was entirely constructed in Paris from 1880 to 1882, and I don't know if you have pictures of those, but you can see the Statue of Liberty looming over the kind of squat buildings of Paris, and it stood there for 2 years because the Americans were supposed to raise the money for the pedestal, and they were having trouble coming up with the cash. And so you couldn't bring the statue to the United States until there was a pedestal for it to stand on. And one of my favorite images is there was a picture of in Life magazine of the Statue of Liberty standing barefoot in some water, freezing. I'm really cold because you have no pedestal for me to stand on. And so eventually, Bartholdi decided he was just going to force the issue, and so the Statue of Liberty was dismantled, taken apart as if it were an erector set, remember those, and packed into 220 crates, put on a boat, sent across the Atlantic Ocean, and unloaded onto what was then still called Bedloe's Island. Its name would change to Liberty Island. And those crates sat there unopened while the Americans were trying to raise the money to do this. They came up with about a third of the cost of building the pedestal, and then Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper man, stepped in, and he used his paper, the New York World, to run a campaign to collect the rest of the money that was needed. And what Pulitzer did was he ran a kind of populist campaign. You know, he said the rich people of New York City are not coming up with the money we need, and so you, the working people who read my paper, you should come up with the money. And he promised to publish the name of everybody who contributed. And pennies, nickels, dimes trickled in, and eventually Pulitzer put together the money that was needed to finish off the pedestal. And so that's how the statue went up.
And his circulation increased by like 100% or something like that, right? As he was doing this work. I want to get back to opening day of opening day. But before we leave abolition behind, I want Nancy, and Nancy, you'll talk a lot more when we get to immigration. But tell me a little bit, you were on the commission for the museum when the museum at Liberty Island updated and added the story of abolition back into the story. If you could tell us a little bit about how that transpired.
Now we're in the 21st century. And so, yes, I was on the Historical Advisory Committee of it's the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation that decided to redo in a very dramatic way. Basically, really, it had exhibits before, but it didn't have a separate museum on Liberty Island. And there was one practical reason for doing this, I should say. I mean, there were other reasons, but there was a practical reason to redo the museum, is because most people who came to the museum, and there were lots of visitors, they couldn't get into the statue. Only a very small percentage were able to get into the statue. So the only thing you could do was kind of wander around the island. And so there was felt that the exhibit was dated and needed updoing, but it needed upgrading, and also it needed to be tell a better story and a more accurate story about the statue, and also draw in visitors, because it would be very compelling to visit the museum. And so one of the that was the one goal of the museum, but also it was to, first of all, I say complicate notions of liberty. That was a big discussion on our committee, and also is evident in the museum that resulted, that not a Pollyannish view of America being this wonderful place, that had liberty for all, but that there were complications along the way, and even in the present, exclusionary barriers that various groups had experienced, including the descendants of enslaved people. And so one of the goals of the museum was to redo it, to emphasize and to remind visitors who didn't know, as we've already heard here today, that the statue's connections to abolition. And so now that is, there's a doc, if you haven't been, I recommend that you go to the museum, and there's a film, one of the highlights, I think, is the documentary film, which all emphasizes the shackles and the chain, and explains also that the French, as we've just heard, that the French creators intended the statue initially as a commemoration of the abolition of slavery. And the museum now makes visible the broken chains and shackles beneath the feet of Lady Liberty, which we've also heard are practically invisible when you go to see the museum. Clint says has told us, right, you need a helicopter, really, to see those. And since most people don't come by helicopter, they couldn't see the shackles and the chains. And so now the documentary includes an aerial shot of the statue, allowing visitors to see the broken chains for the first time, and also to learn about the connection to the abolition of slavery. And also, I do want to also add, it's not, slavery obviously is very important, but also the complications of the notions of liberty, not just in terms of enslaved people in America, obviously that was critical, but also for others coming to America, that it's not just, this wonderful country that we come to that automatically gives you liberty, and that's not true. And so there was an attempt to try to complicate the picture of the statue.
So we're going to go back to the 19th century. We'll come back to the 21st again. But we're at opening day. It's October 28th, 1886. President Grover Cleveland is there. We know they don't talk about abolition at this point. They also don't talk about immigration. In a few words, Ed, tell us what the speeches talked about on opening day. 1 million people are there for a parade. Everyone's excited. What are they excited about?
First thing you have to keep in mind is that there was no good amplification, and so nobody could hear the speeches. And they were pretty standard stuff about America and France being sister republics, and there was a lot of rehearsal of the French contribution to the American Revolution and to the importance of liberty, and the speeches were given by people at the time, the names nobody remembers now, but they were considered to be important orators. But one of the kind of amusing things that happened is that the statue was covered by a veil, so it was supposed to be literally unveiled. And because the people who were working the veil couldn't hear the speeches very well, they missed their cue and they unveiled the Statue of Liberty too soon in the middle of the speech. And so nobody listened to the rest of it. But probably the most important, or at least the most dramatic thing that happened, and this gets to what you just said, is that on the stage in front of the statue, it was all men except for 2 women. And there were a group of advocates of women's suffrage who chartered a boat, sailed out into the New York harbor toward the Statue of Liberty, and they did have a bullhorn of sorts, and they said...
Oh, don't tell them, because Anna Deavere Smith is going to tell. So that, and I'm sure you have a wonderful speaking voice, but Anna Deavere Smith kind of, so with that, I am going to invite, because what Anna Deavere Smith is going to read are actually dissenting. She's not reading what people they're celebrating. And again, 1 million people came to celebrate it. A lot of people were excited about the statue. But there were particular groups of people who had trenchant criticisms of this statue, the suffragettes being one of them, but also Chinese immigrants who had been excluded due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and those who were here were not granted full liberty, and of course, African Americans who questioned the liberty in this country and how it was playing out. So I just want to make a note that she will be representing the words, but not assuming the personas of any of the individuals. And so the sources will appear on the screen as well, but Anna, if you want to come out and...
The names of the people going to be, yeah, okay, here we go. All right, great. Sir, a paper was presented to me yesterday for inspection, and I found it to be specially drawn up for subscription among my countrymen toward the pedestal fund of the Bartholdi Statue of Liberty. Seeing that the heading is an appeal to American citizens, to their love of country and liberty, I feel that my countrymen and myself are honored in being thus appealed to as citizens in the cause of liberty. But the word liberty makes me think of the fact that this country is the land of liberty for men of all nations except the Chinese. I consider it as an insult to us Chinese to call on us to contribute toward building in this land a pedestal for a statue of liberty. That statue represents liberty, holding a torch which lights the passage of those of all nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? As for the Chinese who are here, are they allowed to enjoy liberty as men of all other nationalities enjoy it? Are they allowed to go about everywhere free from insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which men of other nationalities are free? Whether this statue against the Chinese or the statue to liberty will be the more lasting monument to tell future ages of the liberty and greatness of this country will be known only to future generations. Liberty. We Chinese do love and adore thee, but let not those who deny thee to us make of thee a graven image and invite us to bow down to it. The members of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association were the only people who looked with disfavor upon the grand pageant yesterday in celebration of liberty's unveiling. They had been denied a part in the ceremonies on Bedloe's Island, and when they applied for a position in the naval parade, had been advised to go on the same boat with the Cercle Français de l'Arménie. To emphasize their disgust at this treatment by the male managers of the pageant, the women hired a boat for themselves and, without asking anybody's leave, took up one of the most favorable positions for viewing the ceremonies on the island. They chartered the steamer John Lennox, and it started from the West 21st Street Pier at 1 o'clock with 200 members of the association and their friends. Immediately after the veil had been drawn from Liberty's face, Mrs. Lily Devereaux Blake called an indignation meeting on the lower deck. After denouncing the ceremonies just witnessed as a farce, she offered resolutions declaring, quote, that in erecting a Statue of Liberty embodied as a woman in a land where no woman has political liberty, men have shown a delightful inconsistency which excites the wonder and admiration of the opposite sex and other sentiments of like sort. It is proper that the torch of the Bartholdi statue should not be lighted until this country becomes a free one in reality. Liberty enlightening the world. Indeed, the expression makes us sick. This government is a howling farce. It cannot, or rather does not, protect its citizens within its own borders. Shove the Bartholdi statue, torch and all, into the ocean until liberty of this country is such as to make it possible for an inoffensive and industrious colored man in the South to earn a respectable living for himself and family without being Ku Kluxed, perhaps murdered, his daughter and wife outraged, and his property destroyed. The idea of liberty in this country, enlightening the world, or even Patagonia, is ridiculous in the extreme.
Thank you. Those were certainly not in the textbooks that I
learned about the Statue of Liberty from in Wisconsin in whatever year that was. But it does seem, Clint, I'm wondering kind of, because so much of your book is about how we teach history, how might these be useful sources in the teaching of the Statue of Liberty and you taught high school, am I, yes, yeah.
No, I mean, if I could have Anna Deavere Smith come to my classroom, that would, it would create, I think, it would be better for all of us. But no, I think that the use, one of the things that I didn't get a lot of, that I think I certainly could have used much more of, are just primary source documents. I think for me, the experience of encountering primary source documents, encountering the things that people said for themselves, was so, again, to use the word clarifying, in terms of what the intentions of people were. And what happens when there's something that happens when you see the people say it for themselves, right? Whether it's as was so beautifully presented, the language and the words and the sentiments of people for whom the statue did not represent what it was ostensibly meant to in this moment. And I think there's something really valuable to hearing that, because I think it reflects the fact that this tension existed in the origins of the statue, right? I think many people today, over the course of the last decade plus, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think over the course of, the sort of ongoing battle, and conversation and public discourse around immigration, which, is again at the sort of the top of our public discourse as a result of the election happening right now. I think it is the dissonance between the aspiration of the statue and the reality of life on the ground for many people who are in this country have to some degree never felt more distant. And I think there's something incredibly valuable for young people especially, to see that distance is not something that is of their own imagination, right? Or that they're not being hyperbolic, or they're not being overly woke, to use that language, or that they are not, that tension, that anger, that cognitive dissonance was something that has existed for as long as the statue itself has.
And we need to get to immigration, because we need to figure out when it did indeed become connected to immigration. So, and I know that many of you, I promise you will hear Anna Deavere Smith read the New Colossus. But the New Colossus, of course, is the poem on the Statue of Liberty, and while it was written in 1883, it kind of fades from, it never really was known. In the same way that abolition wasn't really known, Emma Lazarus's poem, written in 1883 to raise money for the statue, for the pedestal specifically, was kind of not well known and then certainly forgotten, and immigration was not mentioned at all in the opening of the statue. That was something that was going to happen a little bit over time. But how did it become connected? Well, and actually, before we get to how it became connected to immigration, what's important to note is that in the early years, there was a much more popular poem that I'll ask Ed about, and I'll ask Clint to comment on, but that the statue was connected with anti-immigration sentiment. So Ed, do you want to tell us about it? And I know we have some images too, because there is this, we heard the power of the voice, now we'll see power of the images to kind of get to that moment.
So as you said, Andy, Emma Lazarus wrote her poem in 1883 for a fundraising event for the pedestal, and then it was promptly forgotten. And then the U.S. government decided that they needed to create an immigration processing center because there were so many people coming in. And the first idea was that center for bureaucratically dealing with immigrants would be on the same island with the Statue of Liberty. And so you began in the early 1890s, around when people started talking about what would eventually become Ellis Island, but it was going to be on the Statues Island, you see these really awful images like you see up on the screen of the Statue of Liberty hiking up her skirts because she doesn't want to be sullied by the riffraff coming in from Europe. And so one after the other, and so in that image you have a European garbage ship dumping the scum of Europe at the statue's feet. And so she's presented as being unhappy about that. And so one of the things that tells us is that this is not the only period in our history when immigration has been extremely controversial. And so before the Statue of Liberty became a positive symbol of welcome to people coming in from around the world looking for a better life, it was actually a symbol of rejection or a symbol of concern that all these new people would do damage to our country.
And Nancy, tell us a little bit more of that kind of background. I think, how could you have at the one time a very pro-immigrant sentiment existing alongside a very nativist sense of... Yeah, microphone close to the mouth.
Hard. I mean, if we're talking about the turn of the 20th century, which is the period that we're talking about now, first of all, the statue was not, as we've heard, seen as a celebration of immigration. And there was tremendous, well, in terms of positive, there was a desire to have workers come in. The country was industrializing and to import labor to do that. So I guess that's kind of how welcoming, but there was a desire for immigration, and there was at that time. But there's also tremendous hostility to immigrants in the turn of the 20th century, and it was largely focused on Eastern and Southern European immigrants because they were the vast bulk of the immigrants. And we've heard, actually just to go back to what we heard about the Chinese immigrants, had already actually been excluded pretty much by 1882 legislation. And they were not allowed to naturalize as US citizens. In fact, were excluded. But at the same time, you had really millions coming in from Eastern and Southern Europe. Mostly Jewish, well, mostly Italians. They were the biggest group, and Jews, and of course they were the major groups in New York City. And they were seen to be that they would never become fully American. I mean, people have maybe I should backtrack a bit, a nostalgic idea about immigrants of that time, right? But they were never seen, they were seen by most people, they would never be fully American. They were commonly seen to be polluting America's racial stock. They were not seen as fully white, the way Northern and Western Europeans were. They were sweeping America towards a racial abyss, that they were undermining American values, and there was tremendous discrimination against Italian and Jews in virtually every domain, in housing, in education, in employment. And it wasn't until the mass immigration of Eastern and Southern Europeans ended, and that was due to a number of factors. One, there was restrictive immigration legislation in 1924 that was a result of partly of these nativist movements clamoring to stop immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. There was also, of course, the Great Depression, and there was World War II. So because of that, the statue after that, there was very little immigration. The 1930s, well, the Depression, 40s, 50s, very low rates of immigration. And in that period, the statue became a positive symbol of immigration, reflecting more positive attitudes to immigrants in American society. Now, partly it was because there were so few new immigrants coming. So that was part of the story. But at the same time, the children of immigrants who had come, their parents had come in the early 20th century, late 19th century, they were becoming American. They were growing up, they were born here, they were becoming American, they were moving up the occupational ladder. It really is, the assimilation story to a large degree. They were moving up the occupational and economic ladder. They were mixing with those whose roots were in Northern and Western Europe, in work, in schools, and colleges, and eventually, and neighborhoods, that particularly after World War II, in suburban neighborhoods. And eventually, there was, in marriage, there grew, and if you look, get to the 50s and 60s, there's a lot of intermarriage between these European groups, both Northern, Western Europe and Southern and Eastern Europe. And it was at that time, really around 1960, studies show that that's when Americans began to talk about the country as a nation of immigrants. That was not how it was conceived of before, and also that immigration began to be remembered with a kind of nostalgic glow towards those who had come earlier in the 20th century. And nativism subsided, although I should say, because we're going to get to the present eventually, it subsided for a while. Nativism seems to never disappear in American society. It rears its head periodically when there are these huge immigration
And it's
flows.
interesting, right? Because the poem, Emma's poem that Anna Deavere Smith is going to read in just a moment, that Emma Lazarus, when she writes that poem in 1883, she's aware of the Chinese Exclusion Act. She's aware of the anti-immigrant sentiment, but she's writing into the words of the statue something more positive, right? She's trying to almost write through her poetry to change minds through her poetry, to imbue, to give voice to the statue. So I'll pause there and invite Anna Deavere Smith back out. She's going to read Emma Lazarus's poem from 1883, and also finally, in 1936, when the statue was celebrating the 50th anniversary, Franklin Delano Roosevelt does mention immigration, although you'll note, look at the verb tense in how he's talking about immigration in 1936. So, Ms. Smith. Has anyone seen The Sound of Music when you invite the Von Trapp family singers out? Let me go see.
Do I need to read the name of it?
Emma
it's
Lazarus,
gonna pop
the
up.
new Colossus. Yes, it should
Okay.
come up.
Good, okay. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. I'm going to say it again. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I have to have confidence that the title shows up. For over 3 centuries, a steady stream of men, women, and children followed the beacon of liberty, which this light symbolizes. They brought to us strength and moral fiber. Developed in a civilization centuries old, but fired anew by the dream of a better life in America. They brought to one new country the cultures of 100 old ones. It is the memory of all these eager seeking millions that makes this one of America's places of great romance. Looking down this great harbor, I like to think of the countless numbers of inbound vessels that have made this port. I like to think of the men and women who, with the break of dawn off Sandy Hook, have strained their eyes to the west for a first glimpse of the new world.
Thank you. Thank you. I also just want to pause and say if you have questions that you've written in your cards, people will come to collect them. And we're just going to enter the last section. We're going to talk a little bit about immigration before we get into the Q&A. But I wanted to point out that in that 1930 speech that FDR gives, he's talking about immigration in the past tense. Right? This is right after, not right after, but the 1924 immigration law that essentially closes the doors. And Emma Lazarus's poem, although it's put on the base of the statue in 1903, it doesn't really come into public consciousness until really the 1930s, like after the gates have closed. And of course, in the 1930s, there are many people that would love to come to this country. So there's this interesting thing where that poem that's so beautiful is only celebrated and brought up by people who are in some ways resisting the closing of the doors. So there's this really interesting thing happening here. Clint, I want to ask you as a poet, your thoughts on that poem, and if that poem was ever part of did that ever come up in school or anything?
Well, it's a beautiful poem, and certainly the lines that Anna repeated for us a second time are emblazoned in the sort of our understanding of what the Statue of Liberty, our sort of larger understanding of what the Statue of Liberty was meant to symbolize. It's interesting. I've been spending the last few years on a new book project that's taken me all over the world. I'm sort of exploring World War II memory across the world, and I was just in Argentina. I've been to Japan, Korea, Germany, England, France, and it's fascinating the extent to which the Statue of Liberty is truly seen as like the American symbol. Like it is the first piece of iconography, the first image in many ways. Like if you were to ask someone in so many of these countries that I spent time with, like what is the first image or if you were to draw a picture that like captured America, like so many would still say or draw or talk about the statue. They might say the New York Yankees, but then after that they would say like, after that sorry to all the Mets fans, you know, but they probably say the Statue of Liberty. And so it's fascinating the way that the statue has become synonymous with the country itself across the world. And the other thing that struck me about that is that it very much, that poem feels in line with the tradition of famous American texts that are more aspirational than they are actually capturing the dynamics of a moment, right? Like I think of the Declaration of Independence, I think of this poem, I think of so many documents that and texts that espoused a version of what this country was, but clearly, or some people's conception of what it was, or their conception of what it could be. And it was almost more of it's a sort of North Star. I think, there's a way to conceive of it as a not necessarily capturing what is happening in this moment, but capturing but creating a piece of iconography and then the text within it that are associated with it that allow us to sort of aspire to a version of ourselves that we are not yet aligned with, but that we can hope, I think, to get a little bit closer to each time with, and not just sort of, this is the whole thing about the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice. It's this idea that it does not bend on its own, but there are people who are pulling on it and pushing on it and bending it, and that it takes work to become the country that welcomes the poor, that welcomes the hungry, that welcomes the masses, that does not happen through a process of, just osmosis. It's something that we have to actively work and organize towards.
And it's almost like in that poem kind of echoes that. It's an invitation because the lips are silent and the torch is kind of not lit. It's like that it's up to the reader to kind of do this work, and it's up to the American people to do this work.
You guys didn't know you were getting an English lesson today.
I just wanted to say something about the poem, which is obviously a beautiful poem and very famous. And the famous lines are, the huddled masses yearning to be free. And of course, people still are yearning to be free and to come to the U.S. But since, we've been talking about the past, but if we look even the past 50 years, I mean, the U.S., as most of you probably know, is in the midst of a massive immigration. I mean, there are now, since 1965 was when the
and we
law
have an image too to that point.
Oh,
I mean, I think it's the Lyndon, the LBJ photo signing, signing the 1965 law.
He
Right.
signed it at Liberty Island, yes. But there are now, just to give you a sense, there are nearly 50 million immigrants living in the United States right now. And if you include their children, you get to be about close to 91 million. I mean, that is 1/4 of the nation now are recent immigrants or immigrants who are living here now and their children. And that also, it's not just that the numbers have soared, but where they're coming from and their backgrounds have changed. For most of American history, immigrants were from Europe. I mean, they came from Europe, first North. They were not seen as all alike, obviously, from different countries. But today, since 65, today, most immigrants are from Latin America or from Asia. They're really from all over the world. I was going to say we've been talking about slavery, but 6% of the immigrants in the U.S. are now are African. And if you look at from another vantage point, you look at the black population, non-Hispanic black population in the United States is now 12% foreign born. That does not include their children. So about 1/5 of the non-Hispanic black population in the U.S. are either foreign born or their children, about half from Africa and about half from the Caribbean. So this immigration has had a huge effect, and I think it's part of the reason why there's now looking at the Statue of Liberty and wanting, by the way, to alter the museum, and I'm involved in redoing the museum at Ellis Island, to not just focus on the European immigrants who came 100 or 120 years ago, but also immigrants who have come from Asia, Latin America, and from all over the world. And the other thing, in regard to the huddled masses, I always react strongly to that. I mean, I love the poem, and I think it's great, but the immigrants today are not all huddled masses. 35% of immigrants in the U.S. have a bachelor's degree or higher. If you look at the figures, and I don't know, the figures are not great for the turn of the 20th century, 1% of the immigrants in the U.S. at the turn of the 20th century were professionals. It was not,
They were huddled masses, they're not now.
And on the whole, they had low levels of education. And there are immigrants today who come with low levels of education, but a very substantial number come with fairly high levels of education. So I think there's, we can get into this more. I just wanted to intervene just on the huddled masses issue. Because I think when we're thinking of the Statue of Liberty in 2024, then I think that we're talking to a lot of Americans now they don't go through Ellis Island to come here. I have a title to one of my books is called From Ellis Island to JFK. They come by plane. They're not coming by boat through Ellis Island.
And it's a bestseller in our shop.
Many of them do see America as a hopeful place for them. A place, some of them are coming because of political persecution and oppression, but many of them are coming simply to make a better living and a better life for their children. And they're optimistic, if not for themselves, because they know they're going to struggle here and it's going to be hard. But they come because they're hoping that their children will do better and have more opportunity. Now, we don't, and in fact, I know as a sociologist here, I can tell you, looking at data, and there's a big issue in the immigration literature on how the children are doing. And one title of one of the articles is, "The Kids Are All Right," because in fact, the children of immigrants on the whole are doing better than their parents. And they are moving up, if not dramatically, immigrants never moved up in great spurts. You know, the idea of what my son, the doctor, was not true. It was more my grandson, the doctor. And that's what's happening today. The children of immigrants are making slow gains up the educational and occupational ladder, just as immigrants did in the past. So I have other things I wanted to say.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, this is wonderful. I just want to ask one last question before we get to the questions, but which is from the audience. How can this fuller, more inclusive history of the Statue of Liberty that you have all done such a good job bringing to light this evening, how does it shed light on and help us understand any contemporary issues you might think of?
I think it does, in the time that we're living in and in this election that we're living through, it's very important, I think, for the Statue of Liberty to be a positive symbol of immigration. When nativism is on the rise, when we have a former president running for office who is kind of what we refer to as the nativist in chief, where he has legitimized anti-immigrant rhetoric to an incredible extent. He's talking about immigrants as animals, they're poisoning the blood of the country, they're bringing in bad genes, Haitian immigrants are eating cats and dogs. I think the Statue of Liberty could take on maybe a new meaning, or slightly different or emphasize some of its old meanings in a different way. That it's a powerful reminder of those who've come to the contributions. Let me put it that way. The contributions that immigrants are making to American society. They have always made contributions to American society, but they are doing it today, and I think it's important to emphasize that in the context of what is happening in America today. They ask us, for example, there's immigrants today, as in the past, are building and strengthening our economy. They are not displacing U.S.-born workers overall. They are not, there's a big consensus among economists that is not happening. They include, as I've said, many highly skilled and educated people. They're revitalizing our cities and neighborhoods in New York. It's very clear, that's been happening in other cities as well, and revitalizing many rural areas which have, suffered from great declines. They have lower crime rates than the native-born. They continue to enrich our culture. So although we can't forget, and I think there's a kind of tension between this, the contradictions, we can't forget the exclusions, the prejudice, the discrimination that immigrants experience today and in the past. We can't forget the experience of enslaved Americans, right, which continues to, has a legacy that continues today. Yet we also, I think, have to continue. It's important to tell the story at the same time, especially when we're looking at the Statue of Liberty, which has come to symbolize immigration in our current period. That we think about the contributions of immigrants, the positive the features that they have brought to American society today, and when we're in the context of a society, just to emphasize again, that is now a quarter immigrant or children of immigrants. This is, in 21st century America. So.
Yes. And I think too, right, that this idea of the freedom to also criticize the country and criticize the liberty and question the liberty is also something that moves us forward. So knowing this full past and knowing the criticisms also is part of that, the criticisms and the contributions. Ed, did you want to say something?
Just really quickly, I don't mean to inject a note of pessimism, but I think that a more nuanced and honest history of the Statue of Liberty studied in school would help us understand what we're facing today. And that nuanced history would emphasize that the Statue of Liberty only became a positive symbol of immigration when there was no immigration going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now that, as you say, there is so much, then that symbolism is difficult. And so what I think needs to be recovered, if possible, is the original meaning that we see in Emma Lazarus's poem, that the aspiration, that, as Clint, you put it so well a few minutes ago, that the gap between the aspirations we have and the realization that is wanting, the need to close that gap. But we need to our kids to learn about that gap.
And I think they're also more open, and Clint, you know too, as a high school teacher, like I think they relish the contradictions and the debates.
And can I just add one thing, having done a lot of research on immigrants and talked to a lot of immigrants and their children, I think knowing that other groups in the past experienced this hostility and nativism and had difficulties being, accepted into American society, and that they eventually were, gives a lot of immigrants, certainly my students at the City University of New York, and many that I've interviewed in my research, it gives them an identification with immigrants in the past and a feeling that there may be hope for the future. So let's hope there is better hope for the future. But they do feel that. And I think it's an eye-opener for them to know about what happened in the past, because they don't really, they haven't been taught that in high school. Actually, they get to college and that's where they learn it. But I think that that's an important aspect too.
Okay, we're going to close with one question, but it's a big question. How can we as society strive to fulfill the promises made by the Statue of Liberty, being welcoming to everyone in this polarized climate? And if you can answer this question, we'll make a statue of you. But if anyone.
I think the most important thing, I think about this all the time. In a different context, I've spent a lot of time working in prisons and jails, and wrote my dissertation about the relationship between prisons and education, and have been, again, working and teaching in these spaces for a while. And the thing that I always think about is that, and I think it's relevant to the context of the conversation we've been having around immigration, is that, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, any of us could very easily be in a very different set of positions than we are. And there is nothing inherent to who any of, I'll use I statements, there's nothing inherent to who I am that has made it so that I'm able to be on a stage in this esteemed hall in New York and not somebody who is living in a bomb shelter in Ukraine or in Gaza, or fearful for my life in Sudan, or scared of a cartel in Mexico, or a whole manner of things that affect people every single day. And I think for us to remind ourselves that, again, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, we could have very easily been in any of those positions. I think if that can stay at the forefront of our consciousness, that can provide us with a sense of humility about the things that we have and our sense of deservedness over what we have over other people, or sort of a false sense of deservedness, rather, and then also can give us a clearer sense of empathy and humility through and generosity as a result as we move through the world.
And I think politicians, too, would do well to embody those empathy, generosity, and all of those things. There's so much to say, and the good news is, the bad news is we must close. The good news is that all of these esteemed panelists have written wonderful books that you can get right outside. And though you can have these wonderful writers sign these books. So 1/4 of a Nation, The Statue of Liberty, Clint Smith's How the Word Is Passed is for sale outside. I want to thank all of you for your wonderful comments and analysis. I want to thank Anna Deavere Smith. I want to thank Cooper Union for hosting us. I want to thank the amazing Tenement Museum staff for immigrating here tonight. And also thank the Tenement Museum board and our Tenement Museum member community. We invite all of you to visit the museum and come to our programs and become part of continuing to explore these questions that define us as Americans. Thank you so much.